Upon an eroded cliff top, a man lay still, looking far across the valley below him. Nothing moved. Not a bird, not an insect. Not even the dust seemed willing to cross that plain. The valley was not empty, in the way a desert is empty. Its riverbeds were old wounds, powdered into sand. Once water had run there, in the youth of earth. Now the channels remained, only as the shape of a vanished world. There was still a little greenery, but not the greenery men had once known. Twisted shrubs, coarse grasses, and stringy growths clung to the dying soil. This was the final stage of mankind's long presence on the planet. For unnumbered aeons, drought and sandstorm had done their work. The lands had been scraped, dried, and emptied. The world had not fallen in a single night. It had been taken, almost patiently, by time. Above all of it was the sun, not a god, not a mind. Only the old parent fire, drawing the earth nearer and giving back the gift of life as heat, thirst, and death without intention. And because it came slowly, mankind did not understand it. At first, long ages passed, before terror had a name. Men endured, men adapted, and still they looked for the mild old world to return. But the world was not returning. For a long while, men still trusted the things they had built: cities, walls, instruments, the memory of old seasons. Even when the air grew harder to breathe, they believed that knowledge, patience, and habit would be enough. Then came the age when men could no longer bear their hottest cities. The first towns to fail were nearest the equator. Then others followed. The retreat was not sudden, it was slow, deliberate, almost orderly. And because of that, it seemed less like defeat than it truly was. Not all fled at once. In the cities of the equator, some remained. They made shields against the heat. They sealed rooms against the deadly dryness. Inside rusting towers, they built little worlds where men could still pretend that the old lands might be kept. Then one day, from the newer city of Nyara, the men of Dath sent their signals to Yuanario, the ancient capital. They waited for the answer that should have come. But across the burning distance, Yuanario gave back nothing. Explorers went there. They reached the millennial city, with its towers linked high above the streets. They found no answer, no voices, no panic, not even the horror of decay, only silence held between bridges, walls, and empty sunlit stone. Only then did mankind understand. The cities were lost, the brave posts in the hot lands were abandoned. Behind high basalt walls, 1,000 towns fell quiet. The throngs, the factories, the old activities of men became only blistered towers under the dazzling sun. The old cities remained, but they no longer belonged to men. Their walls endured after their voices had gone. Cactus and thorn entered the avenues. Lizards crossed the courts where crowds had once gathered, and the towers stood white and blind under the terrible noon. The blight did not stop with the lower lands. Year by year, the habitable earth grew narrower. Maps were changed, then changed again, until whole nations were remembered only as names beside rivers that no longer reached the sea. Then the fields began to fail. Grain withered before it ripened. Irrigation trenches held dust. The granaries built for the confidence of crowded centuries opened upon darkness and husks. Men learned then that hunger could be as patient as the sun. For a while, men replaced what nature would no longer give. They made food where no harvest grew. They sealed chambers against the outer air. They tended old engines, old formulas, old stores of power, but each device only postponed the same retreat. Nor did men carry all their greatness with them. Books were left where roofs could no longer protect them, instruments lost meaning in younger hands. The old sciences became half-remembered rites, then gestures, then silence. Mankind survived, but less and less of mankind survived in it. So mankind turned toward the Northlands and the far southern cold. Places once feared as borders of the world became refuge. There were settlements there, small fires, low shelters, faces bent against wind. Yet every refuge was smaller than the world abandoned, and every generation remembered less of why it had fled. The seas did not vanish in one night, they withdrew as the heat had come slowly, almost politely, with intervals in which men could still deny what they had seen. A harbor would seem lower, a reef would stand exposed, a remembered coast would no longer meet the water. The shores became plains, wharves leaned over dust, seawalls guarded nothing, the ports, once filled with masts, engines, nets, and the salt speech of men, became dry courts, where wind moved sand through the places made for tides. Where oceans had lain, there spread white and bitter floors of salt. Old depths became open distances, the bones of drowned things. The shells, the stones polished by ancient water, lay under the sun, as if the earth itself had been turned inside out. Men followed, what little dampness remained. They went into caves, into hollows, into cold cracks, where stone still remembered the touch of water. A dark wall, wet in one corner, became more precious than a palace. A hidden pool could hold a people for a generation. In the last settlements, water ceased to be a common thing. It was counted in vessels, guarded in shadow, remembered in stories by children who had never seen a river. The word sea became larger than anything the living knew. So the race narrowed around thirst, not around kings, not around cities, not around knowledge, around thirst. The numbers fell from nations to villages, to households, to names that would soon have no one left to speak them. And somewhere ahead, in that narrowing, there waited a well. At last, the history of mankind had become a cabin, not a city, not a nation, not even a village, only a low shelter among sickly grasses with the heat outside, and inside, on the poor floor, Mladna lay dead. Ul had not always been so alone. There had been others, or so his youth remembered them. Hunters had gone out into the waste and had not returned. Women had died beside the failing shelter. One by one, the voices had left him. Only Mladna had remained. She was dry, fearsomely old, and hard with the hardness of things that had survived too long. Yet while she breathed, Ul had not been the whole of mankind. By himself, her death made him understand what numbers meant. When Mladna died, the cabin changed. The silence was no longer empty. It had weight. It had corners. It waited in the doorway, under the roof, beside the body. Ul listened until he could hear nothing in the world but his own breath. But Ul was young. He could not believe that the world had narrowed to one breath, beyond the hills, beyond the 3 great peaks he had heard there, might be others. The thought was thin, but it was not dead. So he left before the cabin could teach him certainty. He took Mladna's knotty pole, perhaps for strength, perhaps only because it had belonged to another hand. Then he closed the door, though there was no one to keep out and no one to return. All night he walked. The grasses brushed his legs like dry fingers. Stones cut at his feet. The stars were clear, cold, and useless before morning thirst had begun to speak inside his mouth, but the mountains still stood ahead. By the time he reached the height, the world below was pale with morning. The eroded cliff received him as if it had waited since the beginning. There, with the 3 peaks behind him, Ul looked out. Beyond that valley, he still believed there might be men. And then beyond the pale valley, Ul saw the village. A small huddle of clay block buildings stood in the distance, low and still, under the terrible light. For a moment, that was enough. Shapes made by hands could still look like hope. He came closer. Nothing answered. The air inside the village seemed older than the walls. No door moved except one hanging open on rude pegs. No smoke rose. No footstep met his own. The place was not newly dead. It had been waiting dryly for years. Ul entered, expecting faces. The first face was bone at a rude table. In the dry shade sat what had once been a man. The air had kept him almost carefully. No rot, no smell, only the patient arrangement of death and dust. Then thirst drove him farther. He searched the poor vessels, the jars, the bowls, the hollows where hands had once stored life. They held only dust. Civilization, at its last, had made containers for emptiness. In the center of the village, he saw the well. The curb was rough, dark at the edge, and old with use from hands that had long ago ceased to need it. A chain hung there, a bucket hung there, and below in the blackness, something waited. There was water. Not much, not clean. A shallow darkness below the stones, slimy, stagnant, and still. But it was water. After all the seas, all the rivers, all the hidden pools of the dying world, this little blackness was enough to draw him down. Ul reached for the chain. His hand, dry and shaking, closed on the iron. The stone beneath him was slick. With ancient slime, there was no struggle worthy of a chronicle, no final cry for the ages, only a hand that slipped. He fell into the black shaft. There was a slight splash, no more. The water moved, closed, and became quiet again. In that small sound, smaller than thunder, smaller than speech, smaller than memory, the long labor of mankind was finished. After that, Earth was humanly dead. The cities, the signals, the migrations, the caves, the vessels, the cabin, and the last hope, beyond the mountains, had all come down to one broken body in a little water under the ground. Above the dead Earth, the stars continued. Faraway suns were born, burned, and died without knowing what had ended here. The blackness did not change. No witness rose from it. No judgment came. No meaning answered. At morning, the deadly sun rose again. Its first rays entered the broken village, touched the stones, found the well, and reached, at last, the still face of Ul in the slime. There was no movement, only light, only heat, only the end.